Hi there, it's Andrew Burke from Code School Halifax again, and today we're going to work with pictures. I'm going to show you where you can find pictures to add to your page and how to add those pictures to your page, either as standalone elements or in the background, how you can adjust your content to make those background pictures work better, and also just a few tips on how to work with pictures for the web. All right, hang on, here we go. Okay, so here's our page with all of our new table stuff that we've done and the little highlight that tracks where we move our mouse and everything, and our growing number of recoveries, which is always good to see. But anyway, it looks pretty good, but let's try making it look even a little bit better using some pictures. Okay, so pictures have been a thing that's really spruced up web pages ever since they started supporting them back in the 90s. And there's various formats that work best with the web. So one of them is a PNG, which is a graphic file format that's good for simple colors, slabs of color, sort of logos, things like that. Also allows transparency in the background, which is really handy. GIFs are another one that is similar to PNG. Of course, you can animate GIFs, which is what they're mostly used for these days. GIF, I don't care. It doesn't matter, whatever. The other format that's really popular is JPEG, which is more of a photographic type of format because it's good for subtle changes in colors and stuff. So you'll see those around. And it used to be back in the day that you had to be very, very careful about how big your files were going to be. Your page, I remember the rule of thumb, your page, no web page and all of its assets together should be any more than 40 or 50K. That's more recently moved to 100K or maybe several megabytes these days. But I still try to keep pictures relatively small. They don't need to be any bigger than they need to be. But we'll talk about that in a minute. All these formats, PNG and JPEG and GIF, are all compression formats. So they shrink the file size somewhat from what they would be normally. And of course, you want to adjust the dimensions and things too. So one thing we're going to do, so we thought about adding a picture, would be to maybe do something better with this footer here. Okay, so it just says brought to you by Code School Halifax. Well, we have logos. Might as well try using the logo instead. Okay, so I'm going to bring that logo file over into my project. Okay, bear with me here. And it is a PNG. I'm just going to drop it in. Okay, logo transparent. Won't even have to call it logo transparent. I'll just call it logo for now. And if we take a look at this, and you can even see it in here in the file system. Okay, and it even shows you a preview in here, and you can see from the checkerboard pattern in the back, it's actually got a transparency. So that's kind of nice. That'll come in handy. We don't have to worry about matching the color of the screen to the color of whatever this background was because it'll just shine right through. Okay. Now you notice a few little artifacts of white around the edges. That's from the original version of this picture had white. So it fades to white. So it's probably better against a light background, but that's okay. I am not an expert graphic designer, so you will see this is about as good as I can get. Anyway, so there's our logo. That's great. And we can just put that in. So adding an image tag, or adding an image to a page, involves using an image tag. So let's go and just take this and go image source equals logo. And you can see it auto-completed for you. I could just give you the option. It knows what's in the file system. So I can just say image source equals logo.png. All right. And it's one of those self-closing tags like that. So say brought to you by, and let's see what that does. Whoa, okay. That's really big because it's a large file, because we sometimes like to shrink it down for various things. I brought it from the more graphic design side of things where it's very high res. Let's shrink that down a bit. So we can basically do that down here in our CSS because it's something in a footer. So we can do a selector that says in the footer, any image, which would only be this one. Now we could also give this an ID. So example, like, footer logo. And maybe that's a bit better. So instead of footer image, we could just say footer logo, because we might add a different image in here and might have different rules for that. You could imagine the footer having Facebook links and all sorts of things like that. So anyway, footer logo, and maybe make that width equals 50%. Okay. So that's not too bad there. Now it says brought to you by and then goes all the way over here because it's a sort of inline thing. We still have our old version there. So let's move this around a bit. Okay, so let's rearrange this somewhat. So we can take this and put this in here. So now instead of the word, it's the image. So brought to you by, and then it's wrapped up in a link. So that's handy. Okay, so now we can click on this, it'll take us to the page. One thing, if you're replacing text with an image that's got text in it, it's usually nice to put an alt parameter inside your tag. What that does is it lets you describe what that is. And if images don't load for some reason, or if somebody's got vision issues and they've got a screen reader rather than a just something that shows pictures, this helps them. It'll, instead of showing the picture, it'll swap in the Code School Halifax note. Okay, so that's handy. Also, sometimes, depending on how things are set, if you roll over, some browsers will show the little alt right in there as you roll over. But for example, if our picture is broken, has the wrong file name, it'll show the name in there anyway. So at least if it's broken, it's not too broken. You can still see what's going on. Let's take that back. And let's fix this brought to you by and put this also on its own line. Now, instead of doing p tags and wrapping it up, we'll do this one-off tag called br, which means just a line break. You see this here and there. This page doesn't have a huge amount of content, so we haven't done this before, but brought to you by BR Code School Halifax. Okay, now this right justified doesn't seem to work so well anymore here, so let's make these centered. Okay, so everything's centered. And there we go, brought to you by Code School Halifax. And it grows a little bit if it gets big, but it doesn't grow too much, and it shrinks to fit. So it's always 50% of the width, which is kind of nice. So I like using percentages. Often you'll find 100% is sort of the default for these things if they fit properly. Okay, so that's kind of nice. Now that's just a logo, and that's pretty standard. But there's also ways you can do pictures by making them a background for a page, sort of like give you a texture or something a bit more interesting going on. And now you can get carried away with this and make your page really difficult to look at. We'll talk about some ways of handling that. But let's go and find ourselves a nice picture. And usually backgrounds should be sort of something with texture and sort of content that sort of gives you something to chew on. So I find large, artfully done, good photographs make a good background for this kind of thing. So one place that does that is a website called Unsplash. And that is basically a source of free to use, free to do whatever you want with pictures. And you can search for them. Here's a whole bunch, and they're all quite well done. There's a lot of really good photos. A bunch of them are very timely, as you can see. You can see all this stuff here, photos, but some of them are abstract, whatever, but you can just look things up in here. So we can look up bouquet. So for example, this is for recoveries, right? People have recovered from this disease. And I always think of if you're at the hospital and you're trying to get over your disease, people bring you flowers, right? As long as you don't have a problem with pollen, I guess. So here's a nice flower picture I find. You can sort of scroll through here and find all sorts of flower pictures, and that's all good. So here's a flower picture I found, and let's click that. Now you can click this and see more details. You can download the whole thing. You can share it. You can link directly to the image from Unsplash. But I find I like to download these and twiddle with them a little bit before I actually do anything. And they do like you to give some attribution or whatever. But we're going to do that this time. But here you can see from this, it's by Christy Kim from Unsplash. Okay, and so there we go. And we've just downloaded that image. I'm just going to bring it over from one of my other windows here and put it into our project as well. Okay. So get over to here. There's our project, and just drag this in here. So there is our picture. But you see, it's 913K, so it is a large image. If we do our little info thing on here, you can see it's going to be 3512 by 5268. So these are high resolution, pro pictures that you might be able to use like in a magazine spread or something. So this is way overkill for what we want to do on our web page. I'm just going to give it a slightly better name in this case, call it flowers. Okay, so if we wanted to, for example, we could already just add this to our page right here somewhere at the top, for example, just to sort of show you what it looks like. So we go image source equals flowers. Oops. And you see here, okay, it's so big, it's mostly white, and you can see here it's completely dominated our page. This is way more than we need, and it's really a large file as well. We don't really need that much. Now, there's all sorts of ways of shrinking this down. If you have Photoshop and you're good at Photoshop, that's obviously a great tool for doing that kind of thing. There's services on the web that do this. I use a program called Pixelmator, which is like a light, cheap version of Photoshop. If you have a Mac, you would be surprised by how powerful Preview is. It's the default thing that opens when you try to open a picture. So you can open with, and Preview is one of them. If you open a preview, drag this over here, it gives you the picture here and everything, but it also has tools in here. You can do lots of color stuff. You can actually twiddle with the colors and change settings and saturation and temperature and stuff, which we might get to later. But you can also adjust size, okay, and change the pixel dimensions. So if we change this down to 1,000 pixels, so it's 28% smaller. So it was like a megabyte. And let's save that. It's now 150K, much more manageable. Okay, and if we reload on the page, you can it actually almost fits. Not quite, but close enough for what we're going to try to do here. Okay, so we're not going to show the picture like this directly on our page because it's too big and it's kind of just blocks our space. This is an information page. It's not about the picture so much, it's about the details we want. So we want to get straight to the action as quickly as possible. So instead of putting it just as an image tag here, we're going to make it a background for the whole page. Okay, so there's some magic words you got to do in CSS. So let's get rid of this here. And go into here, go into our body tag, and let's add this picture as a background. So just like here and a bunch of other places we had background color, for example, for our table cells, you can also do background image. And it has an attribute called URL and then just the name for the file. Okay, that's all you need to do there. And now the whole page has this background image. Okay, but you'll notice if it's too tall, it will just keep repeating it, which is a bit weird and maybe not exactly what we want, but you get the idea. This look was great back in the 90s, by the way, but you can see, and it just sort of spreads, and of course it repeats it this way too, horizontally. If it's so, not the best way to do it. You can do repeating pictures, but you got to be careful about where your edges are and things like that. So that's okay, but that's not great. But there's lots of other things we can do to this. So for example, you can go background, repeat, no repeat, and I have to spell it right. You can see it's showing white rather than blue, and it gives me an underline because I didn't recognize it. There we go, background, repeat, no repeat. So that turns off our repeating, but then the rest of the page is blank. So that's not all that useful for a background. Okay, so instead you can also tell it background, I cannot type today, background attachment fixed, so that locks it into place, okay, which is kind of handy. So that gives us that weird parallax thing, which is kind of nice. Now we're going to fiddle with this picture a little bit more too. Oh yes, and then background size, cover. So that shrinks it so it's always fitting into the available space. So you can see here it grows it and it shrinks it. Okay, so that's cover. There's also contain, which will try to make sure it always fits the whole picture in the available space, which is a bit weird because then the rest of the space doesn't go. So these are cover and contain are sort of the two different ways you might be able to work with pictures in various ways depending on the picture. I like cover a lot. It fills the available space. But what you might want to do here as well, because if you have a regular sized picture, you're only going to see the top of this and a bunch of blank space, is I'm going to go back to our picture, I'm going to open it up in preview, and preview even lets you crop things. So preview is really useful. It also lets you sign PDFs and read Word files and do spreadsheets. It's really great. Anyway, so I'm just going to shrink this down and make sure it's mostly the flowers rather than other things there. And you just do edit or tools crop. Okay, so that's going to change things a little bit. Let's save that, come back here. Now we've got our pictures are there. But this is pretty dominant. It's really kind of a bit much. Go back into your picture and change some of the color levels to make it faded a bit better. So if we go to our adjust color and we dial back the contrast, it's kind of just gray. We want to sort of be kind of there, but not super there. And twiddle with these. I never quite know exactly what these are for, but I find I can get a lot of mileage by just dragging things until they sort of make sense. So we're basically making it a kind of a faded back version of an image. Right? A little bit of this goes a long way, Dial back the saturation even a bit. So now we've just got ourselves a much more faded picture. Okay, that's a bit nicer to work with. And we're going to do a few more things here first too. I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to dial it back up just a bit because we're going to do some other things with this content. Okay, so there we go. So now we have our content sections, we have our flowers, okay? But you can see here this overlay on the, the alternating things is a little bit awkward. So we can, for example, this is where we have a background color. We can take this, we can take these things, for example, these panels. Let's start with this top one here, which is the global count, or we can even do boxed section. We can do background color and maybe make it a pale gray or something like that. So we'll do gray and then roll over and dial that way back to sort of a very slight pale gray. Okay, something in that kind of ballpark. Let's see what that does. And RGB, meh. Whoops. Okay, level E. Okay, so now we got sort of in boxes, maybe even further up that chain. Let's make it even lighter. Okay, so that's just slightly off-white, and that's fine. It makes these kind of harder to see, but we'll get work to that later. What we can also do is we can set opacity so that the content from behind shows through. So that's cool. That gives you this sort of neat effect. The only problem is that the actual content is also faded. So that's kind of a nuisance. So maybe this isn't the best here. I often find opacity is good if you have something else on top of that instead. But you can also make your background colors semi-opaque. Okay, so that's from here, and this is what this little slider's for. So you dial this down. See, it's adding another number at the end. That is what's called the alpha, which is you got red, green, and blue, and then this is transparency. So let's make this a gray, but only half transparent, like halfway transparent. Let's see what that does. Okay, now you can see it's got a bit of extra presence in the back, which makes the text a bit easier to read, but it's still showing through some of the content. So you can, of course, go back and dial this a bit further up. Okay, that's a bit better. So now that kind of works a bit better. And we do the same thing, for example, with our nth of type. This color is a bit much, but it might be a little less so if we dial the transparency back. Okay. Okay, now that's maybe not bad. Is it great? Hard to say, but at least it's got some content. And in fact, we can take this and duplicate it and do odd and dial this over here a bit and keep it with the same transparency. So now the table itself is a bit faded. Now, once again, this is all all basically up to personal taste, and everyone's going to have personal taste differences about what they like. But you get the idea here that you can see the flowers through the content, and the content has sort of subtle coloring, which doesn't overwhelm things. I'm going to maybe take this teal and make it a bit darker. Something like that. When you make things transparent, it sort of changes. There we go. That's sort of nicer. You can see the flowers. You can see the content. It doesn't get in the way. It's not too busy. But once again, everyone's going to have different assumptions about this. And if you don't like what comes up and you've got too much going on, just go to your Git and roll that back and you're back where you were again. So there we go. That's the basics of pictures and graphics for the background and the foreground. So there, by the way, is our Brought to you by Code School Halifax. You see it's transparent. You can see the pictures right through. Although maybe the footer should also be a little bit of a background with some transparency. So background color and pick gray again. But this time we'll make it dialed back. See what that does? Okay, that's a bit weird, but you can see the transparency is working there for the picture. So we have multiple levels of transparency. And here we actually showed us the RGB version. You can see here it's from 0 to 1. So we can 0.75, whoops. That makes it a bit more thick, but let's make this a brighter color. And let's switch this to here and dial this back up. Okay. Okay, that's kind of neat. We don't need that top border anymore either. Once you're shading content, you don't need the borders in the same way that you used to. Okay, brought to you by Code School Halifax, powered by Lighthouse Labs. There you go. So there's a bit of content. There's some stuff going on. Maybe for consistency, that footer should be the same as these boxes. So box section, maybe background color. Whoops. There we go. Okay, that's not too bad. Brought to you by Code School Halifax. Okay, so there's our pictures. So hope you enjoyed that. And also, if you want to try this, go find your own pictures. Think of your own color schemes. Think of your own design aesthetics. You can put a background in the body. You can also put background in other content. So you could put your background inside, like, you could wrap the header section, this part here, in a header or some kind of div that's got a name like banner, and then put a picture in the banner in the background, and maybe make it white text with a darker picture, all sorts of stuff. These can have backgrounds, different backgrounds, all sorts of stuff you can do. So keep that in mind as things you can do. I think a lot of you out there probably have much better graphics and visual sense than I do in this case. So knock yourselves out, have fun. And the next step is we're going to go back to some JavaScript, make a few small changes, and show you yet another cool thing you can do in your browser to see how your JavaScript is working. All right, stay tuned for more. See you soon.